Good morning. Good to have you with us. I'm Joe Fryer. Savannah Sellers is on assignment. We are going to begin this morning with President Biden's historic primetime address. He spoke from the Oval Office behind the Resolute desk, explaining why he's no longer seeking re-election, why he's passing the torch to the next generation. Just days ago, he shook the political world, announcing that he would step aside from the 2024 race after facing mounting pressure from within his own party. In his remarks last night, which lasted 11 minutes, Mr. Biden focused on defending democracy and what's at stake in this year's election. He did not mention his age or his health. Here are some key moments from the president's address to the nation.
I revere this office, but I love my country more. It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think it's more important than any title. You know, in recent weeks, it's become clear to me that I need to unite my party in this critical endeavor. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now. Over the next 6 months, I'll be focused on doing my job as president. My fellow Americans, it's been the privilege of my life to serve this nation for over 50 years. Nowhere else on earth could a kid with a stutter from modest beginnings in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Claremont, Delaware, one day sit behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office as President of the United States.
NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba joins us now with more on this historic address. Monica, good morning. So as we just heard, President Biden says he wants to pass the torch to the next generation, specifically his VP. What are some of the key takeaways from the president's address?
Well, traditionally, Joe, when a president gives a speech from the Oval Office, it's not supposed to be political. It's usually reserved for national crises or emergencies. But of course, this speech had all of the shades of politics in it because the major decision that shifted the entire 2024 race is what led to the need for the president to give this speech. So he did talk about passing the torch to Vice President Harris, but he also talked about this unique moment that the country is facing. Here's a little more of what he had to say.
I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. I've made it clear that I believe America is at an inflection point. One of those rare moments in history when the decisions we make now will determine our fate of our nation and the world for decades to come.
And at the end of his speech, Joe, the president essentially spoke to voters in those terms. He said, history is in your hands. Essentially, the future and the fate of our democracy is in your hands, pointing to the election now in November.
What was also striking were the photos released after the president's speech showing that his family was sitting to his left, including his son and his wife. So, Monica, President Biden now has 6 months left in his term. What are some of the priorities he's planning to focus on? I mean, and realistically, with Republicans controlling the House, what can he actually get done?
He mentioned a couple of these, but I think that is the key caveat, that it will be very difficult to accomplish any of them on Capitol Hill, but he's going to try. He mentioned issues like gun violence prevention, voting rights, the climate crisis. But he also talked about something that we've reported and confirmed, which he has teased at, which is introducing reforms and proposals to the Supreme Court. Now, that's something that would need legislation to become reality, but it's clear that that's something that could become a motivating factor for voters. And then overall, he did just talk about this desire to talk about the state of our politics and the temperature in the country. And I think that's a theme he'll continue to talk about in the last 6 months, too.
And Monica, a new Reuters poll out this week taken after President Biden announced that he was dropping out of the race does show Vice President Harris with a 2-point lead over President Trump, falling within the margin of error. Some other recent polls show Trump leading within the margin of error. While many high-ranking Democrats have endorsed VP Harris, we're yet to hear from former President Obama, but we've learned that could change, right?
That's right. And that is a little bit by design. According to our exclusive reporting that's out this morning, former President Obama does plan to endorse Vice President Harris. They've been in close touch. They've had multiple phone calls, and there are now active discussions about a joint appearance that they could have at some point down the line. It's unclear when that would take place, but there was a little bit of a sense here from former President Obama that he wanted to make sure that President Biden had this moment to address the nation, to explain his decision, and to let that breathe a little bit before he came in with that. But we can fully expect it to happen, and it will be notable because he's somebody who could be a really key surrogate on the trail, perhaps former First Lady Michelle Obama. So expect to see that in the coming weeks as they still have to resolve the vice presidential nominee, which could happen, and we expect in the next 2 weeks as well. And then the convention, and all of those things become opportunities for high-profile surrogates like that. Joe.
Monica Alba beginning our coverage this morning. Monica, thank you so much. Last night, we witnessed history, so it's only fitting we talk about it with NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Michael, always good to have you with us.
Same, Joe. Thank you.
In his address, President Biden says the future of democracy is in the hands of the voters. It's striking to me because 5 years ago when he started his campaign, he talked about democracy, talking about Charlottesville. Now it comes to an end with democracy still as the main theme. What stood out to you in this 11-minute speech?
Well, you're right, Joe. Democracy has been the theme of this presidency. He came in just as January 6th had happened in 2021, that insurrection. And throughout this presidency, he's talked about it, and it wasn't spoken, but the reason he got out of the race was because Democratic leaders said someone else would have a better chance, Kamala Harris. The interesting thing is there was no mention of health last night. He is making it quite clear that he's stepping away from power in order to give the Democratic Party the best chance of holding on to the presidency. And that's a very careful line he had to walk, because this was not a farewell address. That's for 6 months from now. He made it very clear, as you and Monica were just talking about, that he's not going to be a lame duck. He's going to do everything he can.
It was a moment of national and historic importance. The president, though, was also surrounded by his family and aides in the Oval Office. Talk to us about the tone he set during his remarks, and how does this compare to Oval Office speeches we've seen from past presidents?
Well, you have to really compare it. I've just said it wasn't a farewell address, but it had the tone of one. Farewell addresses, by the way, started in 1953 at the dawn of the age of television. Harry Truman sat at his desk in exactly the same place that Joe Biden sat last night, and he tried to frame the issues that he had dealt with in his administration and what lay ahead for the future. That's exactly what Joe Biden was doing last night.
President Biden did somewhat briefly talk about his vice president in his remarks, calling her an incredible partner and a leader for our country. How important is it for Democrats to have this generational changing of the guard at the top of the party? And that's the key word here, I think, right? Generational.
Absolutely. In fact, there was a poll this morning published in Axios that says that, taken in the last couple of days, says that the lead of the Democrats, Joe Biden was leading over Donald Trump by 6 points. Now Kamala Harris is leading by a much larger amount. That's happened almost overnight. But, you know, people have this impression that presidents of the past always said, this is who I want to be, my successor, and this is how I'm going to make it work. That's very rare. Theodore Roosevelt did that with Taft. Bill Clinton did it with Al Gore. And now Joe Biden has done it with Kamala Harris. Not only said, this is the member of the next generation that I think should be president, but also made it possible for that to happen almost soundlessly with no big cacophony or conflict within the Democratic Party.
Michael Beschloss, I know you were with us late last night on NBC News Now. We appreciate you getting up and joining us this morning. Thank you, as always.
Thank you, Joe.
Now, we've discussed the person passing the torch. Let's talk about the one who's receiving that torch, Vice President Kamala Harris. Republicans are quickly putting her record under a microscope. She's facing new scrutiny over her time as a California prosecutor, an issue that plagued her during her 2020 presidential campaign when Democrats used it against her. NBC News correspondent Liz Kreutz has more.
Vice President Kamala Harris now using her experience as a prosecutor to take on former President Donald Trump.
I specialize in cases involving sexual abuse. Well, Trump was found liable for committing sexual abuse.
It's a similar message she made 4 years ago during her run in the Democratic presidential primary.
She prosecuted sex predators. He is one.
Back then, some progressives dubbed her Kamala the Cop, and she dropped out of the race. Her supporters are hoping that what was once seen as a liability could now be among her biggest assets, drawing a contrast between Harris, the former San Francisco district attorney and California attorney general, and Mr. Trump, who is convicted of felony crimes.
She is well equipped to prosecute. I want to emphasize, to prosecute the case against Donald Trump.
But as Harris highlights her background, it's also opening up renewed scrutiny of her complicated and at times contradictory record.
There's many cases in which Kamala Harris has been extremely weak on crime.
Republicans already attacking the self-described progressive prosecutor for failing to seek the death penalty for a man who killed a San Francisco police officer and linking her to state policies they say contributed to a rise in crime.
That I will support and defend.
And yet, Harris has at times also been seen as a law and order prosecutor. As district attorney, she touted an increase in felony convictions and supported policies that outraged some progressives, including criminally prosecuting parents of children who skip school.
I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy.
Harris later expressed regret over that law, but now, 20 years later,
I will proudly put my record against his any day of the week.
With polls showing crime has become a top issue for voters, her image as a top cop is one the VP's supporters are now embracing as she makes the biggest case of her political life. Liz Kreutz, NBC News.
Staying with the race for the White House as Mr. Trump tries to win over more voters, his campaign tells NBC News that it will not be holding any more outdoor rallies. That announcement came just as the FBI director revealed more details about the shooter who tried to assassinate Mr. Trump. NBC's Garrett Hake has the latest.
New video showing the moment a would-be assassin fired on former President Trump as people scream and run for cover. The new video coming to light as FBI Director Chris Wray shared shocking new details of the shooting investigation in testimony before a House committee. Wray reporting that the shooter managed to fire 8 total rounds and revealing this disturbing evidence extracted from the shooter's laptop.
On July 6th, he did a Google search for, quote, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy?
It all comes as Mr. Trump holds a rally in North Carolina with security tighter than ever. More Secret Service and law enforcement agents on scene, plus a roof over the candidate's head. There will be no more outdoor rallies this year, campaign sources tell NBC News. The Trump campaign has seen a surge of enthusiasm since the attempted assassination, now gearing up to take on Vice President Kamala Harris.
We officially defeated the worst president in the history of our country, crooked Joe Biden.
Campaign sources say the former president plans to keep attacks on President Biden front and center and tie Harris to her boss's record on issues like immigration and inflation.
She'll destroy our country if she's elected, so we won't let her be elected. We can't let that happen.
Mr. Trump boasting to reporters Tuesday she'll be easier than Mr. Biden to defeat.
She's the same as Biden, but much more radical. She's a radical left person, and this country doesn't want a radical left person to destroy it.
And saying he'd be open to multiple additional debates. Mr. Trump also attacking Harris in starkly personal language on social media as a liar and, quote, dumb as a rock, posting this image contrasting headlines about her racial identity with no other context. Some House Republicans attacking the vice president as a, quote, diversity hire.
100%. She was a DEI hire. He said he was going to hire, and she didn't. Her record is abysmal at best.
Even former Republican Speaker Kevin McCarthy warning his party that attack line will backfire.
I would say 2 attacks I've heard Republicans give that are totally stupid and dumb to do is the DEI attack. She is the vice president of the United States. She is the former U.S. senator. These congressmen that are saying it, they're wrong in their own instance.
All right. Mr. Trump has also said he considers his agreement with the Biden campaign for one more debate void, but that he's willing to do multiple potential debates with Kamala Harris if an agreement can be reached.
All right, Garrett Hake, thank you so much. Today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will speak separately with President Biden and Vice President Harris to discuss the war in Gaza. It comes one day after he delivered an uncompromising speech to Congress. Netanyahu made a series of disputed claims about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and Israel's conduct in the war. Some members of Congress cheered the Israeli leader. Thousands of protesters gathered in the Capitol to denounce him, a split-screen moment that laid bare the divisions over the war. NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez joins us now from Tel Aviv with more on this. So, Raf, this was a combative speech from Netanyahu where he pledged total victory, took on anti-war protesters, and made questionable claims about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Walk us through what he said, and did he have anything more to say about a ceasefire?
So, Joe, President Biden has two outstanding priorities for his remaining time in office. And that, when it comes to the Middle East, that is ending the war in Gaza, bringing the hostages home, and then some kind of framework for a reconstruction of Gaza for its future governance. And it was really striking that Prime Minister Netanyahu seemed to give no detail really at all about either of those topics. I want you to take a listen to a little bit of what he said in terms of his vision for the future of Gaza after this conflict.
The day after we defeat Hamas, a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza, but for the foreseeable future, we must retain overriding security control.
Now, Joe, that line about a de-radicalized and demilitarized Gaza is a talking point Netanyahu has used for some time, but he's really given no detail about what he sees as that potential future civilian administration in Gaza. Is it local Gazan families? Is it the Palestinian Authority, which is in charge of parts of the occupied West Bank? Is it Palestinian leaders outside of Gaza, potentially living in Dubai right now? Really very, very little meat put on the bones of that vision. Jeff.
So we know about the protesters who were at the Capitol, but I'm curious, hostage families, I know they were paying close attention to this speech. How are they reacting? And also, what is Hamas saying about it?
So a lot of frustration among the hostage families that there wasn't more detail about a potential deal to bring their loved ones home. Nearly 300 days after they were taken captive on October 7th, at least one relative of an Israeli hostage was actually removed from the gallery in the House of Representatives after they stood up wearing a yellow T-shirt that said, "Seal the deal, make the deal to bring those hostages home." Hamas, as you can imagine, is dismissing the speech. They are calling it typical rhetoric from a man who is accused of war crimes by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court inside of Gaza. What was notable, Joe, was that a senior administration official briefed reporters after Netanyahu's speech. That official said that they had been down in the Situation Room in the White House. They hadn't actually seen Netanyahu's speech, but they said irrespective of what the Israeli Prime Minister said, there is progress in these talks. And this administration official says they are hoping to see movement next week when Israeli negotiators head back to Qatar to continue these talks. They say at this stage, Israel and Hamas are agreed on the broad framework of a deal, but that there are many, many tricky details to iron out before this can be finalized. Jeff.
So, Raf, as we mentioned, Netanyahu is meeting with President Biden and Vice President Harris separately this afternoon. You mentioned all the progress that's being made, but do we expect to see the Biden administration put more pressure on Netanyahu to get to the ceasefire deal?
Yeah, Joe, I think you can expect President Biden to try to apply more pressure. The families of the American hostages are going to meet with both leaders simultaneously at the White House. That's the first time that has happened. They are likely to apply more pressure. The reality is President Biden at this point is a lame duck, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is somebody who is very, very attuned to the centers of power in Washington. So keep a close eye on that meeting with Vice President Harris, the woman who may be president from January. She is not someone who Prime Minister Netanyahu knows as well as President Biden. Those two have known each other for 40 years. So it will be interesting to see how that meeting goes. Vice President Harris has stuck with the administration line on policy, but she has been more critical rhetorically of Israel than we have seen President Biden be. And then, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu is heading down to Florida to Mar-a-Lago to see former President Trump on Friday.
Yeah. Right. Raf Sanchez. Raf, thank you so much. Oregon firefighters are battling what authorities are calling the largest active fire burning in the nation this morning. Monster flames from the so-called Durkee fire are lighting up the border between Oregon and Idaho. Authorities there are closing roads and issuing evacuation orders. In fact, the National Weather Service says the fire's so big, it's actually creating its own weather system. Meteorologist Angie Lassman is here with the latest on that and more. Angie, good morning. So explain that one to us. How does a fire make its own weather?
Yeah, little known fact. I think a lot of people don't know this. We've seen it before. We saw it happen in the Australia bushfires back in 2019, 2020. We've seen it in Siberia with those fires, and we're seeing it with these fires that continue to burn. And here's what happens. We see a fire get so hot that smoke continues to rise, and we start to see it really warm air ending up working its way higher in the atmosphere at a very fast pace. It cools, it condenses, and we see what happens to be a cloud called a pyrocumulus cloud. And if you know anything about thunderstorms, you know that cumulus clouds are what give us those thunderstorms. That's what we watch for on a regular daily basis when we see these thunderstorms. But the pyrocumulus is that cool air that has a little bit of moisture in the higher levels of the atmosphere. And what we see happens, thunderstorms happen with not a lot of rain falling from them, but we still have that lightning. So this is where we get those dry thunderstorms that you often hear about, where more lightning strikes are happening on already really dry areas with fire happening. And we see some really strong winds from that as well. And that's what we're seeing right now here. You heard it in parts of Oregon and Idaho. We've still got plenty of alerts up when it comes to looking for conditions that are really kind of primed for more fires to develop. And notice how far they expand. Red flag warnings are up, and we will again be watching for some lightning strikes from those dry storms. Meanwhile, if you live in parts of the Midwest over the next day or so, you might notice it looks a little hazy. It looks a little smoky. Nothing like what we dealt with back in last summer when we had those Canadian wildfires burning. But definitely it'll be noticeable across parts of the Midwest as some of that smoke from those Northwest wildfires continues to work its way to the east through the day today. Temperature-wise, that, of course, plays a big role in this. We've seen those above normal temperatures for weeks and weeks here across some of these areas. In parts of the northern plains and the northern Rockies, you're still going to see some of those temperatures running above normal for this time of year. We've got 102 for Scottsbluff, Rapid City running 18 degrees above normal for this time of year with a high of 105 today. Denver expect to hit 97 degrees. And then that heat starts to shift just a little to the east. We've got Denver into the mid-90s, Minneapolis into the mid-80s, Omaha heads to the low 90s. So the warmth is out there. By the time we get into the weekend and into early next week, it's just a little warmer than normal across the Northeast, the Midwest, the Great Lakes. See temperatures in Cincinnati, they will reach around 90 or high 80s through the weekend and into early next week. Washington, D.C. expect to hit 90 degrees on Sunday. New York City, you'll hang out into those upper 80s Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Des Moines, you're sticking into the low 90s, though, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So still going to be warm, not quite as impressive as what they're dealing with out west, Joe, but still a little warmer than normal for this time of year.
Pyrocumulus could be a cool
Spell
movie
it.
name.
Pyrocumulonimbus, too. We add a little more.
That'll be the sequel. All right.
Like Twisters.
All right, Angie, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.